Greetings and welcome to another DomPrep executive briefing held here at the National Press Club. I'm Marty Masuk, the publisher of DomPrep Journal, DomesticPreparedness.com, and the DPJ Weekly Brief, and I thank you all for attending. Today's briefing concludes our 2012 executive briefing series, and what a year it's been. Today's briefing is about regional resilience, more specifically, building resilient regions for a secure and resilient nation. About a year ago, select advisors from the DomPrep40 team met and discussed the effects that the reduced grant dollars would have on local and state authorities. Many questions were asked, and together we only guessed what the answers could be. But frankly, we didn't know. The lack of data from those hit the hardest began this project. This report is the first regional polling of thought from those with the responsibility to be resilient and maintain preparedness. Now to the business at hand. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Thad Allen, Senior Vice President, Booz Allen Hamilton. Today he's leading a firm-wide effort to vision the future of Homeland Security and the future of resiliency and how it can be achieved, which makes him a perfect spokesperson to kick off today's discussion. Admiral, it's my pleasure to have you join us today. Sir, the podium is yours.
We are encountering in this world much greater complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty in our daily events and in the major crises we have to deal with than I can ever remember in my lifetime. But the fact of the matter is our lives are becoming more complex, and a lot of it has to do with the expansion of the man-built environment and its interaction with the natural environment. The more infrastructure we build, the more we have population densities, and the more that interacts, we cease to have events that are natural disasters or man-made disasters. These are actually hybrid events where there is interaction with the human-built environment and the natural environment. Because of that, there's a greater degree of complexity and interaction, and it kind of mirrors a lot of the challenges the government's facing right now. I think it's much less clear about how we move into one of these complex events with the existing relationships between the federal government, state and local government, and the private sector. And you can extend that to the NGO community and faith-based organizations as well. Events do not create the preconditions. Now, that sounds like an overwhelming statement of the obvious, but you would be surprised how many people do not understand that in relation to resiliency. The event does not create the preconditions. To the extent that preconditions exist, they are exacerbated by the event. So Allen's shorthand version of talking to folks locally about resiliency, in my view, is the equivalent of the human immune system. The measure of resiliency, in my view, is the ecological, sociological equivalent of an immune system. And when somebody with a low immune system gets sick, there are greater consequences associated with that. If you have higher density of population, you have higher populations of aging people, you have issues about high-rise buildings and transportation. Those are all preconditions that will exacerbate the effects of the event. But the real issue is, how resilient are we as a community, and how effective is our immune system? How have we inoculated ourselves as a society through social capital, pre-need relationships, horizontal collaboration, and frameworks that actually enable us to withstand these events? And in my view, that is the ultimate measure of resiliency. It is the sociological equivalent of the human immune system.
I really wanted to talk about what we've done for the last year. And you know, along this journey, we've discovered, for example, that there's a lot of resiliency efforts that you will hear explained, that you will hear documented in our report, for example. What happens in this process as we go through the assemblage of the information is a discovery, in fact, a very blunt discovery, that half of the urban area security initiative areas of the United States were recently defunded in the process. So having said that, let me tell you what we found basically as we went through this process. The resiliency we found as we crossed the nation in various ways was that it's a state of mind. It's also a feeling of confidence, and it's also a level of training that's taken place across this nation. It's an expectation of preparedness. At the same time, it's a type of response, and it's a motivator for recovery. It's also, once again, a huge demonstration of various types of leadership. Our journey is really just now beginning, and in this process, what we've got to do is figure out, that this is not some kind of finished government program. This is not the interstate highway or the bridge that spend money on, and when it's over, we cut the ribbon and everybody goes home and they're happy. This may, in fact, turn out to be our bridge to nowhere before this is over, but the real content here is that this is very much like how we defend ourselves from a national defense standpoint. We have started a process that has built up a great deal of resiliency. We have been on that journey for the last 10 years or so. I'm also here to tell you some bad news. Not that it'll happen today, maybe not even next week or next year, but common sense would tell you that when you take a program and defund it, and it's such a vital program to the safety and security of everybody in the community, that in a period of about 3 years from now, it'll be a little weaker. In a period of about 5 to 7 years, when all the guys with white hair like me start retiring, it'll be even weaker. And 10 years down the road, we'll be throwing stuff away like we did back in the old civil defense days when you went down in the base of the city hall and collected all that junk that had just sit there and deteriorated and threw it out. Okay? And then we're on to something else.
From my observation of going through this process, it's clear that after 10 years of federal grants and the adoption of NIMS, that we've stimulated the development of collaborative models throughout the nation. However, from the data, what is less clear is whether these models, 1, are embraced, 2, are understood, or 3, are valued by the various public safety and public health agencies that are intended to support. So I think that's a key takeaway from this whole process. And again, I'm giving you my interpretation of what I believe is in the report. The second takeaway from the report, it's also not clear that the capabilities that have been built to date with this $34 billion that Bill mentioned will survive without leadership commitment. But the question is, if whole community is a great idea, it's tied directly to the work we're talking about here around regional collaboration. But the question is it going to become a cultural norm through the development of the next generation of Homeland Security leaders? And I think that's an open question. And I think the other observation is I think there's significant anecdotal evidence that suggests that more rigorous study is needed to draw conclusions. And then finally, this study provides some clues for the follow-on analysis and research. As we look at multi-jurisdictional preparedness, if we're going to deal with the issues that were mentioned by Bill, I think we have to have a whole new way of thinking about this, because the fact of the matter is, if you think about pre-9/11, Nunn-Lugar Domenici, we were investing about $100 million or thereabouts, small amounts of money, getting a lot of value out of that. And all of a sudden we throw $34 billion at this, and the question is always, how do we measure our outcomes? And we knew the money was going to go down. The question is, how do we continue to keep this going, and what's the floor? What's the right level of investment, and who should be paying?
As the report and the study was done and the surveys were done and the meetings, one of the things that became very evident in the process was the understanding of how policy affects activity, or in some cases, the lack of policy also has an effect on activity at the federal, state, and local level. Policy in and of itself, to many, is a dry subject, but simply put, getting the policy right allows for a tremendous amount of creativity in execution and delivery. We have a policy about preparedness in the nation. Presidential Directive Decision 8, its predecessor, HSPD 8, all talked about an evolution of the policy around preparedness. And in PPD 8's specific lexicon, the word resiliency began to take on an even more defined context. And as we looked at the results of the sessions, there were some things that became very evident, and that is the policy in and of itself is not the wrong policy. The notion of resiliency, the notion of preparedness is something that is embraced at all levels of government and, quite frankly, understood, at least on a surface level, by the public writ large. You know, in Presidential Directive Decision 8, put into words the notions of whole community, whole of government. And those actually are very different things in a way. Whole of government is a construct where, if you really understand the words, it means all of the government working in unison, not necessarily those beyond government. Whole of community is meant to be broader. It's meant to be a much more elaborate construct of thought to involve all levels of government, but at the same time, private sector, NGOs, industry writ large, and other groups. And we'll talk a little bit about how this really manifests itself on the ground, especially when it comes to the bottom-up activities that are taking place all across the country.
Over this past year, DomPrep has dug deeper into the future of resilience, assessing where we need to go with this workshop series. And the initiative has validated many of the lessons learned that we've seen from past disasters in the United States and elsewhere. These lessons include the need for expanded public-private sector collaboration, information sharing, better appreciation of the all hazards risks that we are facing in our increasingly, as Thad said, complex, interconnected communities and the infrastructures that support those communities. While there is continual talk about the importance of resilience infrastructures and communities, there has been so little focus on how do we operationalize this. And we've heard this morning that, yes, we have policy directives, we have national framework for recovery, for response, now coming out for mitigation. It's very high level. The how-to is missing. Tackling these resilient shortfalls, though, is highly challenging because it requires regional collaboration among all levels of government. Now, I remember Bob Steffen telling me about 6 or 7 years ago when we first talked about resilience. He said, Paula, it's so hard to get our arms around this. He's absolutely right. It is. So, obviously, we need to have that collaboration, cross-sector, multi-jurisdiction, cross-function, and we need to have flexible and dynamic leadership and resources. We know this. So what at this point do we do?
I think the issue here is about leadership. There are operational and tactical concerns and requirements that lie there and need effort and work. And there is a strategic statement, whether it's PDD8 or other statements of that nature that sort of help to articulate strategy in a broader sense. But if we expect to see regional activity develop as a real issue, there has to be clear leadership in this process. So we see a set of recommendations, but it will take leadership within the federal sector, within the state sector, to facilitate it. Facilitate it. Not direct it, necessarily. Oh, you can pound on your chest. I direct it, I'm the leader here, and this is the way it's going to be. That ain't going to work very well. They commented on that. They want standards, but they don't want somebody telling them this is going to be your standard. So facilitation of the discussion around the problem becomes important, and the information flow about useful best practices will lead to embrace of standards from a bottom-up perspective where the feds have facilitated the knowledge. It was an interesting experience. So leadership is the call. And on the federal side, the talk is good, the PDD is not bad, but where's the leadership that facilitates this and operationalizes it, as Paula said, is the real challenge.